It's not. All right, I got 1 more minute. Cool. Yes. Say that again? So this is like actual lesson plans that you use to create these kind of programs. Very effective. Oh, did I miss your question? Yes.
I didn't see it on the website.
Oh yeah, I'll leave that. Okay. Might not be the right place for you, but we'll find out. Okay, it's 3:15. So if I can get everyone's attention to the front. I know we're like the second to last session, so we're all kind of brain dead. So first things first, this slide, there's gonna be a lot of content in these slides. So there's a link to the slides right here if you scan the QR code. I'll post it in the Slack as well, and also probably to Chief, because I'm also recording the conversation. That was on purpose because I want you guys to be able to like go home and then be like, how did she say I do that? And then you can open it up. And there's a bunch of links at the end. So, but I didn't want to put like text links and you have to copy down all the text. So welcome, this is Zero to Robot. This is about teaching programmers to beginners. And I'm Katie Wyden. So we're gonna learn about me like briefly. I'm gonna talk about what you need to be successful. We're gonna talk about the lessons that I have laid out, and you can modify them as you want, and kind of the timeline of that. I'm also a recent teacher, and I'm like really into brain science right now. It's like my current pet passion. So I'll also talk about like why this works from a pedagogy level. And then if we have time at the end, I'm gonna have you turn and talk to a neighbor about how you might do this yourself. So just because we're gonna turn and talk to our neighbor, turn to the person next to you, learn their name, their team, and where they're from. Ready, set, go. I would say about 10 more seconds. And you guys can bring it back to me in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm gonna be honest, y'all, my high schoolers are much better at this. Okay, so yeah, sorry, I'm a teacher. I'm gonna make you do that stuff. There's reasons. Okay, so I'm a computer engineering by trade. I did that for a while, and then I was like, actually, I want to be a teacher. You're sitting at a computer during COVID, just kind of like, what am I doing with my life? I used to teach freshmen in college how to code when I was in university. And so that was my first foray into teaching programming. I loved it so much when I was a mentor. I found myself at my real job spending time planning for my fake job as a mentor. So eventually I was like, okay, I've been avoiding this for 10 years. I'm going to finally go be a teacher. So I teach computer science and engineering at Palo Alto High School, just down the street. Let's see. Robot-wise, I've been doing it since 2008 when I joined my team as a freshman. So I'm from Wisconsin. That's me in high school with my buddies my senior year. I helped with the team in Iowa. I don't recommend mentoring in college, though it was unfortunately like an incredibly formative and positive transformation for me. I used to mentor a team in Texas when I lived there. And then now I currently mentor 253. So when I started teaching, I had to like kind of give FRC a backseat. So the purpose of the presentation is to give you actual lesson plans so you don't have to do any planning. You can just pull this up and be like, okay, so today we're going to program motors. And then tell you what makes this effective so that you can apply this to anything, programming, motors, whatever. If you are here to learn how to program, I'm so sorry, this is not the right presentation for you. But you can still stick around, you might learn something, and you might have lesson plans for you to learn the content. So you're gonna need some things to be successful. I used to really believe that all you needed was a dream and a positive attitude to be successful. I've since learned that money and space and time are really, really nice. So first off, you need some sort of skill in the language of your choice. So if your school has APCSA and your kids are learning Java, that's probably a good language. If you are a C++ expert, great. but you need some sort of ability because you need to have at least like a modicum of knowledge to teach kids. If you have experience with FRC syntax, that's great, but you can learn that. And like, if you have the ability to learn stuff, you can also do this. You're gonna need a robot. I'll talk about that next slide. I really like having one computer for every pair of students. I know that's not feasible for a lot of teams, and I'll talk about that too. And then I have these lessons. They take about an hour or two to complete each lesson with actual students. And you can cover, I kind of talk about this, but like those first 3-4 lessons, that gets you like a very helpful student. And each lesson, it depends on the kids. Some kids pick stuff up super fast because they have programming experience. Some kids don't know what a semicolon is, and you have to show them where it is on the keyboard. So it's going to change based off your students. And robot-wise, it's really helpful to have a drivetrain because drivetrains are interesting to kids. Using motors or encoders and sensors is like tangible, real-world things that they will use when programming robots. So it's helpful to have when learning how to program robots. And then extra motors beyond your drivetrain. So if you just have a kitbot, we can make it work. But the more you have, the more it's like a real robot, the better it is as a learning tool. So last year's robot, almost always the best testing platform. If your team cannibalizes them, wait till the last possible second to cannibalize your robot because it's a great teaching platform for programming. So these are lessons that I have been building since like 2018-ish. So every year I'd give them and then something would not go wrong and then I'd tweak it. I wrote these before I was a teacher. And so a lot of this is like, I found out after the fact why it was successful. Every lesson is going to be hands-on. Kids like doing stuff. It's really boring to listen. And if they're bored, they're not learning. It's going to be relevant. So in teaching, we love this concept of like authentic tasks. And these are going to be authentic tasks because they're going to learn how to program robots by programming robots. It's really, really, really important that the lessons are supportive so that there's someone there. It doesn't have to be you. It could be a senior student. But students, if they feel like they're struggling and they're stranded, that's going to be a really terrible experience for them. And especially for students who don't know they like programming yet, that's going to push them away. And I learned that one the hard way, which like, ooh, that sucks. And they're going to be appropriately challenging. So I said I'm like really big into teen neurology right now. So teens are actually wired for risk. It's like part of being an adolescent. And so we capitalized on this by being like, you know, this is kind of a hard thing to do. And they're like, I bet I can do it. So we want to keep pushing them. We don't want to push them too far. That's going to shut them down. But we want to push them. And I love pushing them by telling them that this is too hard and they probably can't learn it in a way that's not like mean. So what we want to avoid in our lessons, and this is something engineers are terrible at. I love y'all. I was one. Too many new things at once. We get so excited and we're like, and then you're going to learn about motor controllers, and then you're going to learn about the difference between a motor controller and a motor and the brain and how it all works. Brains can only handle so much information at once. So we want to be really specific and really pare down what we're doing. If we give them too much information, they just shut down. And like adults do that. We want to avoid unnecessary details. The lead mentor on one of my teams was also the programming mentor. And in the little rotation where they're like, what's programming? He started diving into the details of an IP packet. And, you know, that's super interesting. Like I took a networking class. That stuff's really, really cool. They don't care. You're just confusing them and you're giving them like a sense of like, oh God, I could never learn all of this. And you're also distracting them from like what they actually need to know. I don't like doing large groups. Teenagers are like wired to be social. That part of their brain has just come online and they're very excited about it. So if the groups are too big, you have a few different things. One, they like chat with each other, which I'm fine with. Robots isn't class. But it means that they can be disengaged. And also there's this kind of like threat. So when I have classes, especially the first few weeks, I'm like, okay, does anyone have an idea about this? And no one will raise their hand because they don't want to look stupid or uncool. So I like to avoid large groups. I find about 10 at once is like, ooh, that's really pushing it, which is funny because I teach classes of like 36. And then judgment, teens, stress affects them differently than adults. It takes them about twice as long to recover from a very stressful adult experience than it does for an adult. So we want to avoid judgment because that's like a key form of stress for them right now. So we need to keep the atmosphere positive and calm. But you know, you being genuine in yourself is really engaging for them. So I'm not talking about these a lot, and please don't feel like you have to write it all down. We're going to start with meet the code, and we turn some motors on the first day. Then we make a drivetrain do driving. Then we do some sensing. We do some positional PID. We do objects, and we do my first auto. So you may be looking at this, and you're like, wait a minute. Nowhere in there did she say we're doing syntax. Oh, and some extension. I'm ahead of myself. Some extensions. I didn't write these, but you can do them following this. You can do pneumatics. You can do velocity PID, and like gyros is its own lesson. So I don't start with syntax. I used to. It was 4 weeks of syntax, and it was very boring. And what happens is that's not engaging. And like I have kids who know they want to program in their heart of hearts. They're like, I'm going to be a programmer when I'm older. So they'll sit through the syntax. But I have a lot of kids who they don't know if they like programming, and syntax will push them away. And it's a lot of extra info to teach syntax outside of robots. They have to learn a lot of things that they're never going to use again. So, I'd be like, okay, we're going to learn how to do variables by doing math. Okay, well, to do that, you need to print it to the screen. Okay, then I have to learn about like system.out.print. And it's just like a whole bunch of extra information. It's not relevant. I'm not in this context. I'm not teaching programmers. I'm teaching robot programmers, specifically FRC robot programmers. And what I found is as they need to know that syntax, when they are motivated by the robot, they will just learn it as they need it. They're like, my code didn't compile. I can't make the motor move. And I'll be like, oh, you didn't end your sentence with a semicolon. And they're like, oh, okay, semicolons. So they'll learn it as they go. And I want to keep it engaging and like exciting from the start because they're typically choosing to be at robots from their own free will. So lesson 1, each lesson I have goals and tasks. So whenever you're laying out a lesson, you always want to start with your goals because what you find is if you don't do that, you meander all over the place. So lesson 1 goals, and I know this text is kind of small, is we're meeting the development suite. So we're learning about code VS or whatever you use. They're meeting driver station. They might be meeting how to read a CAN ID. They're meeting the basic structure. So in FRC, we have like teleop periodic, auton periodic. And then we also have to meet the robot electrical components because I'm going to tell them to make a motor object, but they don't know what a motor is. So we open code VS and we just deploy empty code. They just learn how to build and deploy. It's not that exciting, but they need to learn how to do that task. We locate different parts of the structures. So I'll say, okay, where do you think the autonomous code lives? And they'll be like, well, that says autonomous init. And I'm like, ooh, that's close. So we explored, and then we explore driver station. Especially girls, they don't click around naturally in explore. So I like tell them to click around and explore. I'm like, we're gonna have to figure out where a joystick is. Which one of these things looks like something about USB? And we play this game called What's That? And I love What's That. I love it for everything. I just go to the robot and I point at something and I say, what's that? And they don't know. And then I pull an order student. I'm like, hey, what's that? And they're like, oh, it's a speed controller. I'm like, oh, okay, so it's a speed controller. And then we play it again. And it's a really great way to teach them the different components of a robot if they don't know. But it's a game, even if it's the stupidest game in the world. And I can pull in older students, and we'll talk about why that's important. The other cool thing about What's That is it's doing this thing called activating prior knowledge. So some of my kids do know what that is. So I'm not insulting their intelligence by saying that's a motor. I'll be like, what's that? And they'll be like, it's a motor. And I'm like, excellent job, it's a motor. And the other thing we're doing is we're doing finding more than being shown. So when you can, have kids find the information instead of just showing them. So that's why I do a lot of question-based. Where do you think the initialization lives? Sometimes you have to show them because that's just what it is. But when I can have them find something, I do that. The other thing with the activating prior knowledge, especially when you have kids who are brand new to robotics, I try to relate everything to something they're already familiar with. So RoboRio, that's a brain. Motors, that's kind of like muscle. Electronics, those are like our circuit. What are the circuits inside humans called? Nerves, thank you. All right, so lesson 1 is a huge lesson. There's so much we learned. It goes fast because it's not that hard. So I had to split into 2. So then part 1, we learned about where the code lives, and we deployed it. And we played What's That? And then part 2 is they're doing something with it. So we learn how to identify a CAN ID. And maybe I talk about CAN right now, maybe I don't, depends on the kids. We have to use a controller because they just use the joystick to move a motor. We talk about inputs and outputs, and I start putting those words in their brain. And if they don't recognize it right now, that's fine, but they heard the word input now. And then we connect the input to the output. So they take a joystick and they connect it to a motor. Now I do a joystick on purpose because you don't have to do conditionals or anything. Your joystick is just your motor output. So they're going to declare some objects. I won't even tell them what that means. I'm just like, type this code. We'll talk about it later. Oh, I do explain CAN apparently. We use driver station. We introduce them to it. They'll have to learn how to explore it to figure out what controller numbers are, which joystick do we need to do, and we get to test our code. So in this stage, students are just blindly typing. Sometimes they're not because they've come in with knowledge, but sometimes I'm like, okay, and now you're going to type motor1 dot run or whatever the syntax is. I forget because it changes every year. And I also I start teaching them these things, and it's okay that they don't know, and they don't have to know, because right now we're in the thing of just exposing them to the concept. And we keep it simple. So I do everything in Teleop periodic at this point. I maybe tell them how Teleop periodic works if they're interested. If that's going to be too much, I don't. And some of you are like, but that's not how we code. I was like, that's okay. We're not teaching them everything. We just want them to be like, oh, I made a motor move, Mom. How cool is that? And safety starts now. It's really, really important that we set our standards early and we keep them consistent. So when we are turning on our robot to make a motor move off a joystick, I'm like, okay, so when this happens, you look around and make sure no one is touching the robot. And they're like, okay. So I'm like, is someone touching the robot? They're like, yes. I'm like, cool. Tell them to back away from the robot. And then in our shop, you have to yell robot enabled. And we practice yelling robot enabled. And it's very cute because you'll have like these very shy freshmen. And I'm like, they're like, robot enabled? And I'm like, no one heard that. You need to yell. And then like by the end, they're like, robot enabled. And I'm like, perfect. So we teach them that protocol. We start early. Even though they're going to turn on that motor, no one's going to get hurt, but it's important. So then we move into drivetrains, and we do a tank drive. And we do a tank drive because what I want them to do is they now have 2 joysticks they need to use, 2 like controller joysticks. They have 2 motors they need to move. And I can start teaching them about motors that follow each other, because a lot of people use 2 motors on each side of your drivetrain. So we learn about declaring relevant objects, and this is where I'm going to start asking them to do a little bit more work. We're connecting joystick input, we're testing and debugging. And then if kids get this really, really fast, then I'm like, go figure out the math for an arcade drive. And the thing we're doing with this one, the big things we're learning is like orientation of the motors matters. So if you have a motor facing left, forward on it is this way, but then when it's facing right, forward on it is this way. So you're like, okay, make your robot drive forward, and it spins in place. And then you get to talk about debugging and like stuff like that. And I love letting that failure happen. I never correct them. And then we can talk about different ways to fix it. We can talk about how you could use negatives to reverse it, or we talk about how motor speed controllers have settings in them that we can set. And then we're also learning about safe ways to test here. So we never test our robot code for the first time on the floor. We always have it on blocks. We also talk about how when we have motors that are mechanically linked, it's really important we get like our follower and reversing all correct. And I talk to them about that. And I try to be really honest with my students. I'm like, hey, if we get this wrong, something might break. And it scares them a little bit, but I want them to be healthy scared. But there's time. So we'll test following with non-mechanically linked motors. I'm like, well, let's make the shooter follow the drivetrain. And if we get that right, then I'm like, okay, cool, we can like do this. So we're like starting early on how to test things safely, because when we get to things like arms, it's really important we don't kill people. Now, I do this. My team, for the first time this year, had a swerve drive. And I'm like, I was writing these slides, and I was like, oh no, everyone has swerve drive now. So it's really weird to write a tank drive when you have swerve. So if you can, try to just mechanically lock your swerve. I know swerve is super cool. Right now, the lessons are about like motors and stuff. So you can lock your swerve pods. You can use a different subsystem. You can still have 2 motors run off 2 different joysticks. It doesn't have to be drive. It's just that drive is deeply engaging for children. They're like, I'm gonna drive. And if you have a kitbot, like we keep a kitbot around all the time, it's really great because it's a perfect little test bench for teaching big programmers. So if you have a swerve, you can work around it. I have not tried any of these things yet though, because I just use tank drives. Okay, so then we get into lesson 2. That numbering seems wrong. So every time I have a lesson, this could be its own thing. Some of these go real fast, so I have kids, they'll do 3 in a row. So we get into sensing. So we made a motor drive just off like human input, and we start talking about sensing. And so what I really like having is some sort of intake for this that has some sort of sensor attached to it. So one year it was intaking balls, and we had a beam brake. And so we learn about types of sensors. We learn about analog versus digital and what that means. We learn about different ways that we might get information. A lot of our sensors are really stupid, so we just use PWM, which is perfect because they're just 1 zeros. We're learning about conditional statements in this one, and we're using input from our humans and sensors, so their logic's getting more complex. And the other thing we're doing is printing to Smart Dashboard because we need to see the output of the sensors so we can use it. Yeah, I don't really want to talk through all of these because I'm like, you can just read this. But the big thing here is that we're just introducing our logic slightly more complex. They know how to use a joystick. Now we're going to add buttons. And again, we go back to not Smart Dashboard, driver station. And I'm like, okay, which button number is the button that you want to use? And I introduce them to flowcharts at this point. If you've like ever seen the flowcharts with the diamonds and stuff, and like, great, let's write a flowchart for this. They're like, Miss Wyden, or no, they call me Katie at Robots. Katie, that's the easiest flowchart in the world. And I'm like, that's cool. Next week it's not going to be, so write a flowchart. And what's really cool about this is like, if you have a complicated system, I'll tell my kids when they get to the end, I'm like, great. So now that you made it so it intakes until it hits a button, now make it so I can exhale no matter what, but it only intakes until there's a button. And I like just throw weird situations at them that are still situations we actually needed. And then they can continue practicing using ands and ors and all that fun stuff. And like, I have a really fond memory of these like freshman and sophomore girls. They're on electronics, but they were bored one day and they're like, Katie, teach us the code. And I was like, sure, whatever. And they were just like sitting there, they're looking at the whiteboard, they're looking at the computer, they're looking at their chart, they're looking at the computer, and they're like trying so hard to figure out how to make our like beam break indexing intake from last year to work. So these are really authentic challenges that they will want to solve, which is really nice because then you don't have to do as much work. So at this point, we're getting to the part where sequencing matters. So we're using our flowcharts. We're still keeping it simple. Everything's still happening in that periodic loop. And I am like still enabling failure. So at this point, if they forget to put a semicolon in, I might be like, by the way, you forgot a semicolon. Because we want the failure to be relevant to the task. Give me a second. All right. We want the failure to be relevant to the task. So I still want to enable failure. I am there to help them if they are truly stuck. But I don't want to like hand it to them on a silver platter. And like I said, the more authentic the task is, the more the kids will want to do it. The more it is like the real robot, the more it's like a real robot task, the more they're going to be like, I need to solve this. Which is like the words I already said. It's like I planned. All right, so what's really cool is once you get to this part, your programmers can, do a joystick. They can do a motor on off. They can print things to Smart Dashboard or Glass or whatever you're using. They know how to find IDs of motors. You now have a helpful programmer. And at this point, my baby programmers can sit next to the programming team while they're actually doing whatever they're doing. And they can be like adding output statements to the code, or they can be verifying the ID of a motor. It takes a little bit longer, but they are going to be super engaged. They're going to be super excited that they can help. And they just like blossom into these beautiful programmers that like start to learn more on their own. So the earlier you can include your newbies with your experienced programmers, the better. And like, it's this thing of my older programmers get so mad. They're like, Katie, I could fill out the ARM intake code, like the little claw roller intake code, in the time it would take for me to explain to them what they're even doing. And I'm like, I know, but we need to get them started early because then the next time we need them to do something, they'll be able to do it faster. So we go slow at the beginning to go fast later. So then we get into positional PID. This is lesson 4. This is the 4th time I'm programming with kids and they're doing PID. So if you guys don't know PID, it stands for proportional integral derivative. It's like the most common, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, control loop. Yeah, it's the most like common control loop we use in FRC. So we learn about encoders at this point because encoders are kind of weird. I don't necessarily tell them how it works unless they're interested. We learn about what PID stands for. We print a Smart Dashboard, and now we're doing graphs because if you're tuning a PID loop, having graphs is super useful. And I had seniors who did this thing that I hated, where they'd go to the younger programmers and they're like, you can't do PID, it involves calculus. And I'm like, no, I mean, sure, but no. Like, and when I teach kids this, they become like, they feel powerful. They're like Thanos at this point. So we learn how to read encoder values. Again, we're printing to the screen. I'm a huge fan of like debugging by printing. We're graphing them. We're picking a set point. They have to learn the concept of a set point. And then we're tuning our PID. So I was like, not everyone knows what PID means. or what it looks like. And then the cool thing is if you get here and they learn it really fast, then you're like, okay, so make it so like arms are perfect for this. So I'm like, okay, make A, B, get the thing to the floor to pick up the whatever, make B, B scoring it at point A, and C, B, X, B scoring it at point Y. So I make them use different buttons and stuff. So this is really hard. This is like a kind of abstract concept. My younger students struggle with it more because their brains are developing. They're not good at this stuff yet. So I use a lot of analogies and charts. So as I explain each one, I'm talking about how like proportional is kind of like how if you are trying to get to the end of the room, you sprint as fast as possible, and then as you approach the wall, you slow down. That's proportional. I also like to use the example of my dog. So I have a little dog who likes to chase lasers. And if he's on a concrete floor, I'll get him over in that room, and I'll put the laser in the middle of the room. And he's a dog. He's not that smart. He sprints towards the laser and doesn't slow down until he gets to the laser, so he overshoots. And then he does the same thing, and eventually he does that like second graph on the right. And I love telling my kids about that because they're like, I get that. And I'm like, great, once your proportional is right, it's like a dog chasing a laser. We talk about integral. I talk about when you're driving a car up a hill. If you have and you're doing it not with cruise control, you know, you are on the gas and you go up a hill and you have to add a little bit more gas than normal to get up that hill. And we talk about derivative of, I'm just like, it's just so you don't go too fast. Derivative is a weird one, but I use graphs to help them. And we try to basically mimic these graphs as we go. So I'm like, all right, so we increase our P until we get to that squiggly one. And then once we get there, we increase our D until we get to maybe kind of like this guy right here. And we really talk about how fast we want things to happen because kids like to do things really slow because they're scared. We almost never have to deal with I. If you have like an arm fighting gravity, maybe, but it never comes up. So this is one where like focusing on safety and testing is really, really important. We almost always use an arm because arms are really easy to see. And I'm always like, okay, guys, we're going to start with a P. Everything's going to be 0, and our P is going to be 0.01. And our arm is like, and then we slowly increase it. And I want them to have that healthy sense of fear right there. And before all of these lessons, if you are like not sure, do it on your own first. So the first time I taught programming, the programming mentor on the team had like a job to do, and so he was busy. So every night before I would like hang out with programmers, I was in the shop just trying to be like, how do I read an encoder? There's one night it's like midnight and I'm panicking because I cannot get this encoder or this PID loop to work. And then I was in a group message and I was just like, can anybody, it wasn't even about like programming or anything, can anybody help me? And then Alan actually responded. And I was like, thank you. So if you don't have a group of mentors you can ping for help, get one now. But this one is like one that's like, if you aren't sure about this, practice on your own first. Stay after robots one day. It can be kind of weird. So this one's really great. Students can see if it works correctly pretty immediately. We graph it too, but they can also see it visually. You can do it with like a drivetrain and make the drivetrain drive forward 5 feet. It just takes a little bit longer. You have to reset it. Whereas like arms, like did the arm go to 45? And then we go into subsystem objects. So those of you who are like, where's the structure? This is where we get into it. Once I have them doing PID, I'm like, okay, we got to kind of go back to the boring stuff. So we talk about how if they did all of this in one piece of code, it gets really messy and really gross. And so now I'm like, okay, we actually have these things called objects, and we use them to organize our code nicely. And so this is one that like I always kind of just hand off to my experienced programmers. I'm like, you go help them with that. But they, start moving their stuff into subsystems, and then when they learn about the object, like concept of calling functions. Now, I say like make a new subsystem object. That's a huge ask for a novel programmer. What I actually recommend is giving them skeleton code that they're going to move their stuff into. So give them a class that's drivetrain, give them a class that's ARM, give them all the functions, and just have them fill it out. Because making stuff from scratch, as we're going to talk about, is really, really hard. So we want them to have, oh my God, I'm running out of time. Sorry. We want them to have like skeleton that they can just fill out. This is where we start explaining function headers. We now have them hooked. We can be boring now. And I'm like very explicit. I'm like, at the start, we have a return type. So if it says void, there's nothing to return. How functions work in return is I'm still bad at teaching that to high schoolers. Something about that really breaks their brain. But just keep trying, keep saying the same thing. Eventually it'll click. And then at this point, I am finally like, okay, guys, proper naming conventions. My team in Texas, up until this point, one of the motors on the drivetrain was called Gatsby, the name of my dog, and the other motor was called Captain, the name of the other dog. Because it makes it fun and they like it. And at this point, I'm like, okay, we have to use real names. Although some of them were like, that motor's and that motor's ah. And I was like, we can't, this is gonna be nuts. And then the other thing is in my code, like at this point, I've never talked about variables. It's actually really easy to avoid variables in FRC. So at this point, you probably are gonna need to talk about variables if you haven't already. Okay, and then my numbers are all off. At this point, we're at my first auto. And this is where we're now using those subsystems to link things together. And I just do like bang, bang, point and shoot autos. Like call command arm, wait 5 seconds. Call command drive, wait 4 seconds. And this is one of those things where it's like, it's actually not that complicated. They've probably done something similar in like block programming, but it's nice to do it after they've already written the other functions. And so we make a chain of commands. So I'm like rushing through these in part because you'll have access to the slides. And I'm more interested in telling you about the pedagogy because that's like the thing I'm nerdy about. So at this point, you're gonna need to provide additional commands. We're really in safety zone. I was at a regional, at a practice field, and the kids were testing their autos, and they didn't they're bad at foresight, high schoolers are. We have to like help them with that. They didn't think about wherever the robot was gonna go, and it like almost ran into one of my kids, and I was really mad about it. So we have to make sure we're like really on the safety situation. Have a kid hovering over the e-stop button or spacebar or whatever. But at this point, we're really getting more hands off. We're just like, here's your goal. Here's the blocks you might need. Go. And at this point, they're pretty self-sufficient. They want to learn it. Like they want to figure it out. And I have a little dependency tree. So you can teach these in whatever order you really want to. I always start with meet the code and motors. That makes sense. And I go to drivetrain next. After that, if you want to go straight into like pneumatics or objects, you can do that. Like, you know what's important to you. I like my order, but like you can do your order. Certain things require other things to be functional, right? Like if you want to teach your kids path planner, they probably need to understand autonomous and like positional control. Also, I don't recommend velocity PID until after positional because kids, velocity is weird. They're like, oh, the motor's spinning. And I'm like, cool, is it spinning at the right speed? And they're like, well, it's spinning. And I'm like, that's not it. So I like doing velocity after positional. Also, like gyros become way more interesting when you have positional control. Okay, this is the part I'm excited about is the pedagogy. So when we're working with high schoolers and when we're teaching anybody really, we have this thing called Bloom's taxonomy. So unlike engineering, education's first principles are like really, really new. And they're not really that battle tested. But we have to start at the base and go up. So when we're just telling them, hey, write down this thing, we're getting to the remembering stage. So that's why we play what's that. That's why we just have them type what we tell them to do, is because they have to be exposed to it first and they have to remember it. And if you're like in education, you're like, Bloom's taxonomy has problems. I'm happy, but I'm not worrying about it. Once they remember stuff, then they can put it together and understand what's going on. So until they know how to make a motor object, then they can figure out how a motor object affects what's going on. Once they understand stuff, then they can start applying it. So we're like, for a lot of these things, we're just focusing on those first three because applying is 90% of the game. So we're taking things that we already know and we're applying them to new stuff. So example, like I have them write a drivetrain code. Okay, now you're gonna take that and you're gonna apply it to intake. And it's slightly new, slightly different. Yeah. Once they get there, then they can start analyzing and they can make like, okay, what's the better path forward? And I don't really know the difference between analyze and evaluate. And then they can go to create. So this is why I don't have them make a subsystem from scratch. That's really, really hard. So they're gonna do that after they've done everything else. The other thing we're working with high schoolers, especially in robotics where they are like choosing to be here, is this thing called the zone of proximal development. So it's Vygotsky, very exciting. So if we move too slow, they're bored. And if we move too fast, they're frustrated. And this is like a thing I think I see a lot of us do is we're like, and IP packets. And they're like, oh God, no, what? So we need to be in this sweet spot. And it kind of sucks because everyone's like, just be in the sweet spot. And you're like, how? Which is why I like my lessons. I feel like I kind of hold on to that sweet spot the whole time. So they're learning through something called scaffolding. So scaffolding is where you're applying supports to make it accessible. Things like use a flowchart to map out your code. Here are some commands you might need, but I'll have you pick. Those are types of scaffolds you can provide to make something accessible. Also things like providing skeleton code so that they only have to fill in the parts that are relevant to what they're learning. So we want to be really careful. I used to be a person that was like, I don't want them to ever feel challenged because then they're going to run away. And I'm like, oh, I was just boring them because I was going too slow. So if you're like, this is a lot, I have great news. Being a lazy mentor is being a good teacher. So first off, have students teach. I almost always, after I teach a lesson, I have them teach it to the next kid. I'm like, I don't want to do it, you do it. The other reason this works really well, besides me not having to do as much work, is high schoolers are, again, the social part of their brain just came online. They're really good at it. So they'll listen to their peers way better than they'll listen to you. And the kid who's teaching it suddenly has to know it, so they get better at it. So I just have this cute little chain of ducklings where I'm like, okay, duckling number 1, here's how you turn on a motor. And then they say, okay, duckling number 2. So it's a really cute thing where I have like kids in all stages, but they just teach each other after they've done theirs. I do stick around while I do that. I'm not just like, okay, duckling number 1, hope you repeated everything perfectly. Because if they say something wrong, I want to be right there to be like, no, actually, don't know. So be there, but like let them just teach each other. It's way easier. They love knowing things. They love being the smart person. I model not knowing. I think the best days mentoring are the days where I'm learning with my students. So there's one day, something in our code was just weird. We were missing a dependency. And the kids, it was like beyond them, right? So the 3 programming mentors, we all are just taking turns of 5 minutes at a time, banging our head against the wall, like, okay, so I found on Chief Delphi that someone said this, and we're doing this all out loud. We are narrating our thought process. We're telling them where we're going. We're telling them why. And then like our freshman at 2 a.m. was on Slack, like, guys, I solved it. So like they can do a lot, but we were narrating what we're thinking, what we're learning, so that they understand how to solve problems. I've said this a million times, let them fail. Robotics is a safe place. In school, failing is like the worst thing that could ever happen to them because their parents tell them they'll die or something. So encourage failure, encourage like celebrating failure. It's kind of hard, but like whenever the robot does something funny, I'm like, guys, isn't that hilarious? It did something wrong. So I just try to make it fun. And then this one's really, really, really important. Unless you're in a situation where it's way beyond the kids, never type. Whoever is typing is the one learning, which is why I don't like having big groups. So when I have kids and I have like multiple students programming on a single task, always, always, always have the least experienced person writing. They might just be the robot that is hitting the letters and someone else is doing the thinking, but they're going to get so much experience just by typing. They're still engaged because the other kid might be solving the problem, but they're just like, they're still a part of it. When they're not doing that, it's really easy for them to sit off to the side and then start thinking about a TikTok video they saw last night. If you have a bunch of kids at the same level, rotate who's typing. And this is why I'm like, I really like 1 to 2 kids per computer. And like 253 only has like really 2 programming laptops. So I just stagger. I'm like, okay, today these 2 kids are learning this, these 2 kids are learning that. And that works pretty well. So I have a little bit of time. So what I want you to do is with the person next to you, because like we just attend these things and we go home and we're like, that was a nice talk I listened to. So what I want you to do is like turn to the person next to you. What's a robot that you might use to like run these lessons? Let's start with that one. So talk to your person. What's the robot you might use? Do you have one? What are you going to need to do? Go. Yeah. All right, let's take about 10 more seconds. And let's put our eyes on me in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Ooh, we're terrible at this. Thank you. That was so helpful. Yeah, we got our quiet coyotes. I never do that with my kids. Sorry if the counting down is like, we're not children. It's just like the easiest way to get people back to the front. Okay. We're gonna have time for Q&A. Just a thing, if you are planning your own lessons, it's really, even I don't like doing it all the time. It is really valuable to start with what are the skills I'm trying to teach and laying those out specifically. What do they need to know? We tend to like have a billion things in one lesson. And so like figuring out what their prior knowledge is really valuable. What are the tasks gonna be? And then what's the bare minimum? You're always gonna have a kid who wants to learn more, and you're always gonna have a kid who's easily overwhelmed. So if you know what the bare minimum that you need them to get is, you can be much more efficient when you're talking to them. Oh, look, I had little additions. It's like I knew what I was gonna do. Yeah, great. Your task should always be hands-on. I know I'm lecturing to you, but like, don't lecture to them. No one's having fun. Okay, so what questions do we have? Now would be a good time. Yes.
So how involved are, I guess, how involved are your other programming experts in training?
So the question was, how involved are my other programming mentors during this training? I have been on team from like 1 of 2, and the second one's always busy. So I could have other programming mentors more involved. My team is trying to bring out more programming mentors, but we're still solving the problem of new mentors coming on and not knowing how to jump in.
That leads into my second question. So
Great.
I'm more on the technical side.
Yes.
Us, like, really technical people on the
Yes.
How do you prevent yourself from?
By knowing what the bare minimum they need to know is.
Okay.
Like, I think I was probably born to be a teacher, so I have it a little more innate. But like, this is why I'm like, what's the bare minimum they need to know? Try to focus on that. You're gonna have kids who are gonna want to jump into the weeds with you, but like, you don't want to lose all of them. Yeah. Which is why, like, this is why I like this, is like having this little plan. I do point to, I have a bunch of resources. So I actually wrote like tutorials in 2018. They're outdated. They were outdated as soon as I wrote them. But in that, you can see actually how I did step by step and like specifically what I thought was important to know at that time.
Yeah, so that was definitely.
Yeah, and so on this, I have there are 2 links to the same place. It's like a GitHub page, but I have the actual text lessons as well as like just outlines of what I cover, so you can modify it to your curriculum. Yes.
More about like how you manage the teaching environment specifically. So we have a problem where sometimes other students that have idle hands or idle minds will come in and kind of try and distract their peers.
Yeah.
While they're working on this stuff, and then that pulls them off. And how do you find effective ways to
I'm managing the teacher environment, keeping distractions out. Sometimes I'm just mean. I just like, go away, get out of here. We're doing work. Like, I mean, you'd have to be active about it. They're high schoolers. They want to socialize. It's after school. They're tired. So I tell them to go away. We had one kid who he wanted to like actually work on code, and he just came in and he just like, I have important work to do. I'm very important. And we actually pulled him into the other room and we're like, hey, listen, what you just did, we had these kids learning stuff and it was really beautiful. And you just killed all of that momentum. I want you to sit down and just watch what happens when you're not involved. And like he sat and watched that and like, you know, they can grow. We just have to help them pull them aside. But I also just like shoo kids away. We're in like a class, we just have one classroom that we work out of. So distractions are a huge problem. And it's just like being on top of it. I'm always in a 5-foot radius. And I just yell at, like, I don't yell at kids. I'm not that person, but I literally am like, shoo, go do something else. I don't care what, but please be away. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think it is to an extent. The interesting thing for me was getting the kids closer together. We have a bit of a larger space.
Yeah.
And we tend to program on our practice field.
Yeah.
At least around the edge.
My Texas team
So
did that.
we've got kids over here, we've got kids over here. It's like, I kind of have to play defense against people coming in and doing that. But
The other thing that might help is like, this is where it's like having 2 kids working on something at a time. If there's too many of them, then they can get distracted. It's like a resource. I don't like the answer being have money. But the answer sometimes is like, just pare down who's working at a time. It can be hard, but when you have more experienced students who know how to go through these lessons, then you can like duplicate yourself. But if there's too many of them, it's too easy to not be engaged. Is really kind of what it comes down to. And being like, shoot, you're not helping, go away. Yes. Mm-hmm.
One or two dry phases to throw in, or it makes that difference.
It's fun. So the question was like, what do you do if you have like 5 groups of students in pairs, right? But you only have 2 drive bases. And like, that's a real thing I run into. I mean, I would do it with like 6 kids on their own laptop and 1 robot. We just take turns. So I'm like, all right, person A, are you ready to go? Great, you have access to the robot. Person B, please disconnect from the robot. You're like air traffic control. Like, okay, you get to go. Okay, now you get to go. So there's just waiting periods where it's kind of like, sometimes they're gonna be bored and they're just gonna wait. But yeah, I just like kind of do that. What's really nice is when our team is one of those like easy come, easy go teams. And so it kind of works well is when kids are like kind of coming and going. I'm like, all right, you just finished. Great, you come over here, your turn. It's kind of like, it's really just air traffic control. It's not always like 100% efficient, but it works. Does that answer your question? Okay, yes.
So I'm a big fan of the XRP.
Okay.
We had a real very experienced team, so we have super programmers. Who's too busy
Mm-hmm.
working on the real robot to help the kids who are just coming up.
Yeah.
So the kids were playing with the XRP, got it out, and were driving it, but they weren't really programming it. So I said, okay, I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to put black tape around the table,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to have the robot go back and forth without going off the table. They had that in 5 minutes. I said, okay, now I'm putting a box on here. I want you to push the box off the table, not fall off the table. They had that in another thing. So they know sensors,
Yeah.
and they have the basis of programming the big robot, because it's WPI
Mhm.
or a pilot school.
Yeah, I have not played with the XRPs, but that's a great low-cost solution for getting more test beds.
Plus, it's tutorial in Java, so
Yeah, and a lot of, yeah. All right, I had a question over here. Do you still have a question in the purple shirt? Okay, I guess not. Any other questions? Otherwise, it is time, so I'll be like, thank you for being here. If you need to leave, go leave. If you're like interested in teenage brains, I have all these resources in here. And yeah, and if you have other questions, come on down. I'll chat with you about it.